Marius Voss went to Sidonie Merle's door to kill her, not in anger. Anger was from men who couldn't afford consequences, and Marius could afford almost anything. He went, because she had vanished, and because she had vanished carrying the one small thing that could unmake his entire world. 2 days before a wedding that would weld his harbor to a Marseille empire. A missing woman holding his secrets was not a worry. She was a wound that hadn't closed. He expected to find a traitor, someone smug, someone counting another family's money. Instead, when the reinforced door finally tore loose from its frame, the cold of the place reached him first, and behind it, folded on the floor of a freezing room, was the woman who had been cursing him under her breath in French for 4 years. Barely conscious, still whispering, still, somehow trying to keep him alive. By dawn, the wedding was ash. This is how it happened. The pins went in one at a time, and Marius Voss stood still enough to let them. He watched himself in the triptych of mirrors while Ludovic knelt at his hem, murmuring to the fabric as though it might argue back. The suit was the color of deep water, almost black, cut narrow, so the shoulder rig underneath it disappeared into the line of him. Marius did not take the rig off. Not here, not even for a wedding suit. "You are holding your breath," said Isor, from the low velvet bench along the wall. She didn't look up from the swatches fanned across her knees. Gold leaf, bone, a deep oxblood she kept returning to. It makes the shoulders pull. Ludovic cannot fit a man who braces, like he's about to be shot. "Have it," Marius said. "Break it. We have 400 guests, and a photographer flying in from Milan." She lifted the oxblood to the light and studied it against the window. Isor. Esteve was beautiful the way certain knives were beautiful, balanced, cold, made for a single clean purpose. Her family owned the Mediterranean, the way his owned the North Harbor, and in 2 days those two things would become one thing, sealed with a ring and a signature and enough champagne to drown a lesser man. "My father wants the toast in French and English both. You'll manage the French? I have people for the French. You have one person for the French." A thin smile crossed her mouth. "And she isn't here." Marius said nothing. But his eyes moved without asking his permission, to the empty stretch of floor beside the third mirror, the place where Sidonie Merle always stood during these things, tablet in hand, unbothered. Turning the world into something he could use before he'd finished asking for it. She wasn't there. She hadn't been there in 2 days. In 4 years he had never once seen her flinch. When 2 of Calder's men had come to blows in the outer office last winter, real blows, a letter opener somehow involved, Sidonie had stepped between them with an armful of shipping manifests and asked, in the tone you'd use to request another coffee, whether they might possibly settle it after she'd finished the customs filings. Because the Port Authority shut its doors at 5, they had stopped. She had finished the filings. That was the whole of Sidonie Merle, a woman built to the exact size of any room, who made dangerous men feel faintly embarrassed without ever raising her voice. He remembered the exact moment he'd understood she was dangerous. Not the interviews, not the spotless references. It was a Tuesday, late. The 2 of them alone in his study after a call with Marseille had gone badly. He'd said something dismissive and turned to the window. And behind him, quiet, certain no one who mattered could understand her. Sidonie had breathed a single sentence in French. "Espace de monstre sans corps." What a heartless monster. Marius had learned French at 9 years old, in a cold house. From a colder man. He had simply never told anyone. He'd let the whole world assume the boss spoke English, and his grandfather's Italian, and nothing else. Because a man who is underestimated hears everything worth hearing, he'd turned around. She had already gone back to her screen, composed, invisible, the insult tucked away where she believed it would stay forever. "Repeat that," he'd said. She'd looked up. "Wary, sir. What you just said." He'd let the smile come, slow and unhurried. This time, "Look at me." The color that had climbed her throat was the most honest thing he'd seen in months. She hadn't repeated it. But she hadn't apologized either, and that the refusal, the steady chin, the way she held his eyes, and simply waited to learn what it would cost her, was the moment Sidonie Merle stopped being staff and became a person he watched. That was 4 years ago. He had understood every word she'd muttered since. Marius Isor's voice reeled him back into the room. "You've gone somewhere." "The translator," he said. "Sidonie, when did anyone last hear from her?" Isor made a small, bored sound. "Your assistant misses 2 days, and you make that face. Replace her. Whatever she does, someone cheaper does it." Smiling, she laid the oxblood down. "We have a rehearsal dinner. My father arrives tonight. This is not the week to chase a woman who organizes your calendar." Marius stepped off the platform. Ludovic made a wounded noise about the hem. "She doesn't organize my calendar," Marius said, and something underneath the words made Ludovic gather his pins and discover urgent business in the next room. "She holds the keys to accounts your father would open a vein to see. She keeps the codes for every off-book route between my docks and his. She carries more of my secrets in her head than any man on my payroll." He thought, for no reason he could name, of the small worn medal she was never without, thumb-polished, tucked under her collar, the one thing on her that was ever truly hers, and set the thought aside. "And she has not been seen in 2 days." Isor's expression didn't move, but her stillness changed temperature. "So one of two things is true," Marius went on, quiet now, shrugging into his shirt. "Either Sidonie Merle has walked those keys to a buyer, or someone took them off her." He fastened his cuffs, slow, deliberate. "I'd like to know which before I marry into anything, and if it's the first, then I'll do what I do with a leak." He didn't say the rest. He didn't have to. She'd grown up in a family that spoke the same silence. He left her there with her swatches and her 400 guests and her photographer from Milan. By the time the atelier door swung shut behind him, Marius Voss was no longer thinking about the wedding at all. Bram had the car running before Marius reached the curb. "Where to, boss?" Bram was 30 and built like a loading door, and he'd learned to ask his questions with his eyes on the mirror, instead of on the man. "Ardwick Row, the dead end, past the old tannery." Bram's hand stalled on the wheel. "That's the trench, boss. Estif's people have been sniffing around down there for weeks. We're not cleared to put a shoe on that pavement till the ink's dry." Drive, they drove. The rain came down thin and constant, and the city changed its face block by block as they went. The glass towers of the waterfront surrendering to shuttered mills, then to streets where half the windows were plywood and the other half were simply dark. Marius watched it slide past the glass and felt something cold take a seat in his chest, because he knew, down to the exact figure, what he paid Sidonie Merle every month. It was enough for a clean flat on the harbor, a doorman, a car of her own. It was enough that she should never, in any version of the world, have had a reason to live out here. He had held her address for a full hour before he'd understood that he had never once actually looked at it. He had never looked at a great many things. In 4 years, she had told him almost nothing. No photographs on her desk, no mention of a family, a hometown, a single ordinary Sunday. She took no holidays. Twice a year she would ask for a Friday afternoon and come back on Monday with the faint gray of a long drive smudged under her eyes, and he had never asked where she went, because asking would have meant admitting that he wanted to know. He told himself her silence was professionalism. Sitting in the back of the car now, watching the trench close in around him, he understood it had been something more like a locked door. And that in 4 years, he had never once tried the handle. The last week, before she vanished, returned to him uninvited. She'd been at the printer late one evening, and when she bent to clear a jam, she'd gone still for half a second too long. A small, deliberate stillness, the kind a body uses when moving, hurts. He'd asked if she was all right. She'd said she'd slept badly. She wore long sleeves in a warm room and kept her left hand slightly curled, and he had accepted every quiet lie she handed him because accepting them was easier than the alternative, which was noticing that something was wrong with the one person who never permitted anything to be wrong. He'd had a wedding to plan. Marius pressed his knuckles to his mouth and made himself finish the thought he'd been circling since the atelier. If she had carried the keys to Thibaut Estave, if the codes and account numbers she guarded were already in Marseille hands, then the alliance was no alliance at all, and Sidonie was the reason it would put him in the ground. And he would have to answer that the way he answered everything. The idea sat in him like a swallowed stone, and turning it over, he found something that unsettled him more than betrayal. He did not want her to be guilty. He wanted to shake her. He wanted to stand in front of her and demand to know why she had cracked the smooth glass surface of his life, why she had made him feel the floor shift under his feet. That was the thing he couldn't forgive. Not the missing keys. The worry. She had made him worry, and he hadn't known he still had it in him. "Here," he said, "cut the lights." Bram eased the car to the curb across from a row of brick buildings, leaning on one another like drunks at closing time. The gutters ran black. Somewhere above them a dog was barking itself hoarse, and no one was answering it. "I'm coming up," Bram said. "You're staying with the car." Marius turned his collar up against the cold. "If I'm not back down in 20 minutes, you don't come looking. You leave, and you burn everything with my name on it." He stepped out into the rain before Bram could argue, and stood there a moment, looking up at the dead black windows of the building, where the most trusted person in his world had been living, like she had something to hide. Then he crossed the street. The lobby had no lock, because nothing in it was worth locking. The inner door hung open on a single hinge, and Marius stepped past it into a stairwell that smelled of damp plaster and standing water, and beneath both, something faintly sweet he chose not to name yet. A bare bulb buzzed on the first landing. The rest of the climb belonged to the gray half-light bleeding through windows no one had washed in years. Water ticked somewhere inside the walls like a slow clock. Behind a door on the second floor, a television played an argument to an audience of no one. He went up without a sound. Marius Voss had learned to move quietly in houses far finer than this one, and the habit never asked about the neighborhood. Third floor. Fourth. The number he'd carried across the whole city waited at the end of the corridor. 4C. And the door was wrong before he even reached it. Not because it was broken, because it was never supposed to be able to break. In a building where every other frame had gone soft with rot, hers was in newer slab, steel cord, hung with a good deadbolt, and a second lock beneath it. It was the door of a person who understood, precisely and from experience, exactly what walks in through the ones left open. Both locks were thrown. Even here, even bleeding, she had bolted herself in. That told him more than he wanted to know. She had lived here braced. She had spent her own money to armor a door in a building the city itself had given up on, and she had done it without ever letting one flicker of that fear reach the smooth, unbothered face she wore outside his office. He had never seen it. He had never once thought to look. Marius drew his weapon. Then he set his shoulder to the door and drove into it. Once, twice. The steel slab held, but the rotten frame it was bolted into did not, and on the third blow, the whole thing tore loose from the wall. It swung wide, and the cold inside came out to meet him like a breath held too long. The apartment was almost empty. Not robbed, empty. In the deliberate way of a place where a life had been kept small on purpose. A thin mattress on the floor, its blanket folded down square and sharp as a soldier's bunk. One chair. A card table under the window, bearing a laptop, a scarred hard case, and 3 burner phones, lined up so straight the row looked measured. No photographs, no warmth, nothing soft anywhere in it. For 4 years he had paid this woman enough to live in any tower on the harbor, and she had been sleeping on a floor in a room that held nothing but her work, and the winter leaning against the glass. Sidonie. His voice dropped flat into the bare space and came back wrong. Only the rain answered, hurling itself at the black window, and that thin, sweet wrongness in the air, thickening now, drawing his attention toward the back of the flat, Whether he willed it or not, he moved through the room. The kitchen was a single strip along one wall, a kettle, two mugs washed and set to dry, a shelf of tinned food, and nothing living, the refrigerator dark and standing open on its own emptiness. He turned down the short hall that ran to the back. That was where the room began to tell him what had happened. A handprint on the wall at shoulder height, dark, dragged downward, 4 fingers and the long trailing smear of a palm that had been holding a body upright and slowly losing. Below it, another, lower. A boot scuff, carved through a stain, gone nearly black, on the boards. And at the mouth of the hall, half caught in the lantern light spilling from the room beyond, lay a small silver disc on a snapped chain. The medal she always wore, the one thing on her that had ever belonged to her and not to him, dropped or torn away in the dark. Marius crouched and picked it up, the little saint cold against his palm. The chain snapped clean through and closed his fist around it, without quite knowing why. That hard, unfamiliar knocking had started up in his throat again, and for a moment the wedding and the empire and the whole careful machine of his life stood a very long way off, and there was nothing left in the world but the trail of a failing hand across a wall, and a door at the end of it standing half open, breathing cold into the dark. He followed the prince. He reached the door. He pushed it open. The bathroom was the size of a closet, and she was on the floor of it. Sidonie Merle sat jammed into the gap between the base of the toilet and the lip of a rust-streaked tub, one knee drawn up, the other leg stretched straight out before her as though bending it dragged at the wound in her side. A camping lantern stood on the tiles at her hip, throwing a hard white ring up a wall furred with old mildew. She wore a man's undershirt, washed, thin, and colorless, and the entire left side of it, from beneath her arm down to the waist of her leggings, had gone dark and stiff and shining. Both her hands were bound in strips torn from a towel. The cloth blotted through, and between two of those trembling fingers she pinched a sewing needle, trailing a length of heavy waxed thread. She was trying to drive it through her own skin. She couldn't. Her hand shook too hard to line the needle up, and every failed pass tore a fresh, jagged breath out of her. Her face was ash beneath a bruise that had bloomed from cheekbone to jaw in a slow tide of green and yellow. Sweat glued her hair to her throat. And she was not. Marius registered it, with a slow, sickening drop, like a stare missed in the dark, holding a phone, or a rival's number, or any single one of the things he had crossed the entire city, armed and braced, to find in her hands. She was holding a needle. She had been folded onto a freezing floor for 2 days with a blade wound in her side, alone, trying to sew herself shut with a steady hand she no longer owned. He had knelt beside dying men and never lost the rhythm of his own breath. This put a fist clean through the center of him. He had spent the whole drive across the city rehearsing this room. He had built a dozen versions of it behind his eyes. Sidonie at a table counting est of money. Sidonie with a packed bag and a one-way ticket. Sidonie with a gun and a story ready in her mouth. Somewhere around the shuttered mills, he had decided what his face would do, what his voice would say, and precisely how it would end. Not one of those imagined rooms had held a woman bleeding out on cold tile, trying to sew herself shut so that he would keep breathing. Every word he had prepared left him at once the way air leaves a punctured lung. The needle slipped and rang faintly off the tile. Her head came up. Her eyes found him and traveled over him once. The gun, the coat, the rain still running off him onto her floor, glassy and overbright, and swimming with fever. She studied him a long moment, as though weighing whether he was real or one more thing the heat behind her eyes had built out of wanting. Then her split lips moved, and what came out was dry as paper, and in French, and somehow almost amused. Tu es en retard. You're late. Marius. Let the gun drop to his side. In English. You're late. The breath meant to be a laugh, caught halfway out and turned into a flinch. 4 years. I keep your calendar and you still can't be on time. for the one appointment that ever mattered. Her head lolled back against the tub. Don't just stand there dripping on my floor. Marius, shoot me or help me. I have a terrible headache, and I honestly can't tell you which I'd prefer. He crossed the closet-sized room and went down onto his knees in the cold water and her blood and felt neither. Up close, the wrong sweet smell resolved into something specific and very bad, and the dark spreading through the undershirt was worse than he'd let himself believe from the doorway. He reached out and closed his hand around her wrist, carefully, the way a man handles a thing already broken, and drew the needle and its thread from between her fingers. Who did this? It was not a question. His voice had dropped into the low, level place that made grown men suddenly remember appointments elsewhere. Don't use that voice on me. I've typed the memos. It comes from. It lost its magic years ago. Her eyes sagged shut, then hauled themselves open again on willpower alone. And nobody shot me, if that's what the gun is for. Do I look careless to you? Thin, worn through scorn. It was a knife, a very good one. In the hand of a man who had been paid extremely well to make certain I never reached your door. He peeled the sodden towel back from her side, and his jaw locked to keep the sound in. The wound ran along her flank beneath the ribs, long and deep, the edges swollen and inflamed, the skin around it already flushed the wrong color. It had pulled open again where she'd reached for the needle. Whoever had cut her had done it slowly, deliberately. He had seen that kind of work before, and knew what it meant. This had not been meant to be quick. Someone had wanted her to have time to be afraid. "Why didn't you call a doctor?" he said. "Why didn't you call me?" "Because your doctor answers to your consigliere." She said it flatly, watching his face to learn whether he already knew. "And your consigliere is the man who sold you." The words dropped into the cold room and sat there, taking up all the air. "Say that again," Marius said, very softly. Sidoni held his eyes. Fevered as she was, the sharp thing in them that had made her worth every cent he'd ever paid had not dimmed by a single degree. "The alliance is not an alliance, Marius. It's a burial. The Estivs aren't merging with you. They're taking everything you have, and they mean to do it at your own wedding, in front of 400 witnesses, and let the whole city watch you raise a glass to the people who killed you." She dragged in a breath. "You die at the signing. Something. Clean. Poison in the toast, most likely, so there's no vulgar gunfire to spoil the photographs. They pin it on a rival house. Izor weeps beautifully in black, inherits the alliance as your grieving widow, and by spring, her father owns your harbor without having fired a shot. And Calder, the name came out of him like a splinter. Renzo routed the money first." Her voice was fraying now, but she pushed the facts out in order, the way she did everything. Small transfers, dressed as vendor payments, for the gala, flowers, wine, the string quartet, all of it laundered through a shell company into a bank in the Caymans that only the Estevs use, and then it stopped being about money. She swallowed, her throat clicked, dry. "He gave them the rest, the layout of your yards, the rotation on your personal detail, which nights your dock runs thin. He handed Thibaut Esteve the keys to you, and called it a dowry." Marius did not move. Renzo Calder had stood at his shoulder since they were 19 and starving. Renzo had taken a bullet meant for Marius's father and never let anyone forget it. And Renzo was, at this very hour, in a warm, bright house across the city, pretending to fret over the seating chart. "You said you got proof." "On Tuesday I intercepted the courier carrying the hard proof. Scans of signed side letters, account authorizations, Renzo's own handwriting on half of them." Her ruined mouth curved, awful and proud. "The courier was one of Estev's blades, faster than his file made him sound. He put the knife in me on a stairwell above the docks." She raised one bandaged-wrecked hand a few inches and let it drop. "I put him down with his own knife, and I took it off his body, and I did not. Whatever else you decide about me tonight, let go of it." "Where is it?" Her eyes moved. a small, deliberate flick toward the silver medal, still forgotten in his fist. "St. Christopher," she breathed, "patron of travelers. Pop the back. There's a card behind the saint." I couldn't think of anywhere on this earth they'd be less likely to look than around the neck of a woman they'd already decided didn't matter. Marius turned the little disc over and found the seam of it, the near-invisible hinge, and something in his chest went cold and terribly still. "Then, why?" he said. And it was not the boss's voice anymore, not the quiet killing register, only a man's, stripped bare and knocked off its feet. "Why didn't you come straight to me? 2 days, Sidony. You were dying on a floor. Why not come to me?" For the first time, she looked away from him. "Because you were choosing napkins. Quiet. Not cruel. Only true, and worse for being true. You wanted this wedding so badly, you'd stopped watching the shadows in your own house. If I'd come to you with Renzo's name and nothing solid in my hand, you'd have decided I was the one lying." That the little translator had finally overreached, or lost her nerve, or been turned by the other side. Her jaw tightened. "I have watched you bury men over less than an unproven word. I was not going to become the story you told afterward, to explain why you'd had me killed. And this." He couldn't finish it. He only moved his eyes across the freezing, empty room, the squared blanket, the 2 mugs, the winter in the glass. "My brother's name is Malo." She said it very simply, and something beneath the exhaustion finally gave way. "He's 22. 3 years ago, he went off a wet road outside Lyon, and hasn't stood since. The place that keeps him, well, with a garden he can see from his bed, and people who are gentle with him, costs more every month than you would believe of me, so I sent it there, all of it." She looked at the bare boards. "I let the whole world think I had nothing, because a woman who has nothing can't be robbed, and can't be bought, and isn't worth the trouble of leaning on. I made myself into the last thing in this entire organization worth taking. A thread of breath. And it turns out I was the only thing holding it up." Marius couldn't speak. He looked at her, at the collarbones standing sharp under gray cotton, at the hand she had cut to ribbons keeping his name alive, at that small, brave, squared-off blanket, and understood, all at once and far too late, the true size of what he had been walking past every morning. Outside, past the black glass, the rain kept falling, and across the city, in a warm house full of white flowers, Renzo Calder was checking his watch. He worked in the lantern light, with what little the room could give him. There was a first aid kit under the sink, the cheap gas station kind, half of it already spent on her. A bottle of clear spirit stood on the cistern, some brutal thing meant for drinking, not for wounds. He held the curved needle in the lantern flame until the steel darkened, let it cool, and threaded it fresh with the waxed cord. "This is going to be worse than what you were doing to yourself," he said. "Everything you do is worse than what I do myself. It's practically your business model." Her eyes stayed shut. "Hold on to something." She got a fist around the lip of the tub. He poured the spirit into the wound. Sidony's spine bowed off the tile, and the sound that tore out of her she bit in half against her own shoulder. Rather than let it become a scream, her whole body shook under his hands. Marius held her through it, jaw locked until it ached. And when the worst had passed and she was breathing in fast, shallow pulls, he began to sew. He had closed wounds before, his own, his men's, in rooms worse than this one. It had never once felt like this. Every pass of the needle through her skin landed in him like a charge read aloud, and each one was a thing he had failed to see. The stiffness she'd blamed on a bad night's sleep, the curled hand, the twice-a-year drives, the armored door in a dead building she had been bleeding in plain sight for years, quietly, expertly, and he had signed her checks and looked the other way. "You've got the hands of a bricklayer," she managed, "and you've got the manners of one. Hold still." He tied off the last stitch, cut the cord with a pair of nail scissors, and began to wrap her side with gauze. Firm enough to hold, careful enough not to grind the raw edges together. As he worked, the collar of the undershirt slipped, and he saw what the long sleeves and button throats had always covered. The pale seam of an old scar across one shoulder, a shiny coin of a burn on the inside of a wrist. A quiet map of everything she'd absorbed so it would never reach him. 4 years of taking his organization's blows and handing him coffee with a level hand. Then the phone rang. Not hers. His! The burner in his coat the number 3 living people had. It buzzed against his ribs, obscene and bright in the freezing dark. He didn't reach for it. He looked at her. It's her, Siduni said without opening her eyes. It's gone 11. She'll want to know whether you're bringing the medal or whether she should send someone to make sure the courier finished the job. A thin breath. Answer it. Let me hear what a burial sounds like from the inside. He drew the phone. ICR glowed on the screen. He set it to speaker and held it low between them and kept his eyes on Sidoni's face the entire time. Where are you? ICR's voice came out of the little speaker, tight and small. My father has arrived. The rehearsal dinner is tonight, and you have vanished into the trench chasing a filing clerk. The florist still needs a decision. The photographer, Izor, his voice was very calm. It was the calm of a man standing in a house already burning, deciding at last to let it go, is threatening to leave, and I will not be humiliated in front of what? There's no rehearsal, he said. There's no signing. There is no wedding. Tell your father the arrangement is dead. And tell him I know precisely how it was meant to end. Silence. A long, airless drop. You can't. Her poise split straight down the center. Do you have the faintest idea what my father will? Your father sent a man with a knife to a stairwell above my docks on Tuesday, Marius said. That man never left that stairwell Tuesday night. She saw to that. The proof he was carrying is in my hands. And every word your family was careless enough to write down is going to be read back to you soon, in a voice you will not enjoy. He paused. You should have chosen the wildflowers I saw. You wanted the whole city to watch. Now the whole city is going to watch something else entirely. He could hear her breathing. When she spoke again, every warm thing had drained out of it, and what was left was pure esteve, cold to the floor. If you do this, there is no version of the next year where you are still alive. There's no version where your father leaves my city breathing if he's still in it by dawn, Marius said. Don't call this number again. He ended the call. No theatrics, no crushing it in his fist. He simply pressed the button, and the screen went dark, and the room was quiet again, but for the rain, Sidoni had opened her eyes. She was watching him with an expression he had never seen on her, raw, unshuttered, cracked wide by fever and by the thing he had just done in front of her. You just canceled your own wedding, she said, on a bathroom floor, holding a needle. 400 guests, and I disliked at least 80 of them. You've spared me a long, bad evening. A laugh broke out of her, wet and startled, and immediately painful. She pressed the back of a bandaged hand to her mouth. You are going to get yourself killed, probably. He was still holding the medal in his other hand. He looked at it, then at her. 4 years, he said. You thought I didn't understand a single word of it. She went still. Every curse, he said quietly. Espèce de most, imbécile, va au diable. I understood all of it. And I understood the rest, too. The parts that weren't insults. The morning after the Basari job, when you thought I was on a call, and you said it under your breath, restez en vie, stay alive. He watched the flush she could never quite govern climb the side of her neck. I heard that one too. I just didn't know what a man like me was supposed to do with it, so I did nothing. For 4 years, I did nothing. Marius, not tonight. He slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back. Tonight I'm doing something. She weighed almost nothing. It opened a fresh, cold fury in him. How little of her there was to lift. How easily this starving woman had carried his entire world while letting her own go to nothing. She made a faint sound of protest and he ignored it, standing with her, held against his chest. "Where are we going?" she mumbled, her cheek falling to his shoulder. "Home, my doctor." "And then," he said, carrying her out of the closet, past the empty room and the squared blanket and the 2 clean mugs, "you're going to help me take Renzo Calder apart at the joints." She was already gone, slack against him, her blood soaking dark into the ruin of his shirt. He carried her down 4 flights of groaning stairs and out into the rain, and Bram came out of the car fast at the sight of what was in his boss's arms. He was leaving his wedding behind him in the dark. He was walking straight into a war. And for the first time, in longer than he could name, with the weight of the woman who had bled to keep him breathing held tight against his chest, Marius Voss felt completely dangerously awake. The gates of the Voss estate rolled back, and Marius was out of the car before it had fully stopped. He carried her in through the front doors, across a floor of pale imported stone, his boots printed with mud and her blood, and the house he'd spent a fortune making flawless turned his stomach with every stride. It smelled of cold beeswax and cut lilies and money. It smelled of nothing human at all. He had built a mausoleum and called it a home, and the most alive he'd felt all year had been in a freezing closet in the trench, with a lantern burning on the floor. "Blue room," he told Bram, taking the stairs 2 at a time with her limp against him. "And wake Farron, now, doctor." Farron arrived inside 4 minutes, coat thrown over pajamas, bag in hand, and stopped dead at the foot of the bed at the sight of who was on it. "Is that Miss Merle? Fix her." Farron answered up a chain of command that ran through Renzo Calder. Sidoni had said so, and she was never wrong about who reported to whom. Marius waited, in the time it took the doctor to open his bag, and let it go. Renzo would be dead before the man could take a call from anyone. Not a word of this leaves the room. Farron. The doctor met his eyes, nodded once, and asked nothing. Farron didn't waste breath. He cut away the soaked undershirt and the dressing Marius had tied, and his face changed as the wound came clear. "Who closed this?" "I did." "You bought her time." "Not much." He was already in motion. Gloves snapped on, a line run into the back of her hand. A bag of fluid hung from a painting hook because there was nothing else near enough. Temperatures 40. The infections in the blood. Whoever cut her rolled the blade. Coming out, the muscles of ruin. He laid 2 fingers to the inside of her wrist, and his mouth thinned to a line. "But that's not the first thing that'll kill her." "Marius, when did this woman last eat a proper meal? Her body has nothing to fight with. No reserve. It's as if she's run on coffee and sheer stubbornness for the better part of a year." The words went into Marius like a blade turned slowly. He thought of the catered lunches billed to his office, the dinners he'd eaten without tasting, while she worked at the desk outside his door. He had never, not one single time in 4 years, asked the woman whether she'd eaten. He had assumed his money built a wall between her and hunger. He had assumed, it turned out, comfortable things about every part of her, and been wrong about all of them. On the bed, Sidoni stirred, not waking, but somewhere far below waking. In the country the fever had built for her. Her lips moved, and a thread of French slipped out, faint and slurred, the automatic language of a mind whose guard had finally dropped. Farron glanced up. "What's she saying?" Marius leaned closer to catch it. It wasn't an account number, or a route, or a name he needed to act on. It was a boy's name, said the way you'd say it, to someone small and frightened of the dark. "Melo, ça va? Je suis là, ça va." "It's all right." He straightened slowly. "Nothing that concerns us," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "She's a long way from here." "Whatever she needs," Marius said, his voice flat and level over the tremor that had started somewhere beneath his ribs. "Blood, if it comes to that. Take mind. We're the same type. I had it checked years ago against exactly this kind of night." Farron glanced up, and something careful moved behind his eyes. Marius Voss did not open a vein for the people who worked for him. Marius Voss opened veins in other people as a matter of business. But the doctor only nodded and bent back to his patient. She's stronger than her body has any right to be. I'll fight for her, but she needs stillness, and she needs real sleep, and knowing her the way this whole organization knows her. A dry glance up. I wish you luck with that. A knock. Bram filled the doorway, his expression grim. Boss, the house is lighting up. Estev's father wants to know why the rehearsal's gone dark. He hesitated. And Renzo's downstairs? Walked in 20 minutes ago, all smiles, asking where you got to today. Wants 5 minutes, face to face. Says he's worried about you. For a long moment Marius said nothing. He looked at Sidonie, the sharp collarbones, the tangle of tubes now tethering her to the living, the bruise stark against the white pillow, and the guilt in his chest cooled as he watched, and hardened, and grew edges. Every instinct he owned wanted to go downstairs and end Renzo Calder in the foyer, on the pale imported stone, and be done. He didn't. A debt consigliere tonight was a flare sent up over the whole city. Esteve would know within the hour that his plan had a hole in it, and everything Renzo had sold would vanish behind new locks before Marius understood the full shape of what he'd lost. No, he would smile at the man who had sold his life, and shake his hand, and send him home, believing the boss was still blind. And then at his own hour, in his own way, he would dismantle Renzo with the whole picture in his hands. It was the coldest decision he'd made in years, and he made it standing over a woman who had refused, wounded and half dead on a stranger's floor, to move against Renzo without ironclad proof in her hand. She had taught him something tonight without meaning to, without even being awake for it. That rage spent early is rage wasted, and the cleanest cut is the one you wait for. So he would wait. He owed her at least that much patience, and a great deal more besides. Tell him I'll be right down, Marius said, softly. Tell him it's been a difficult day. He did not add that Renzo Calder had no notion yet how difficult, or that the most dangerous thing in the house was no longer the smiling man in the foyer. It was the woman asleep in the blue room, and everything she had sewn inside a St. Christopher medal. Renzo Calder was exactly where he always was, propped in a doorway, at his ease, grinning like the whole world was a private joke the two of them were in on. There he is. Renzo pushed off the frame. He was broad and easy and handsome, in the way that made strangers trust him 3 seconds too fast, and Marius had loved him like a brother for 20 years. You look like hell. Where'd he disappear to? Iser's been detonating every phone between here and Marseille. Had to put a dog down, Marius said. Old business, ran long. Anything I should know about? And there it was, the small, bright flick of hunger behind the concern, so quick that a man not hunting for it would miss it entirely, the way Marius had missed it for months. Nothing that won't keep till morning. He clapped his oldest friend on the shoulder with a hand that did not shake. Go home, Renzo. Big couple of days ahead. I need you sharp, always am. Renzo grinned, and let himself be walked to the door, and Marius stood on the step and watched the tail lights swing out through the gates, and thought, with a calm that frightened even him, dawn. I have until dawn to learn everything you sold, and then I take you apart. The study smelled of cold coffee and gun oil by 3 in the morning. Marius sat at his desk with the little card from Sidonie's medal seated in a reader, plugged into a laptop that touched no network and got nowhere. The files opened, that was the cruelty of it. They opened, and they were useless, because half of them were written in a dense private shorthand, French and Corsican doc, slang and initials that meant nothing to him, or to any man he could safely wake at this hour. It was the Estev's own cant, and Sidonie had spent a decade swimming in it. No one else on the coast could read a line. He was still staring at the gibberish when he heard the sound in the hall, not the tread of a guard, but a slow, dragging shuffle and the soft shriek of a wheel. She stood in the doorway, upright by force of will and an IV pole. She'd found one of his shirts, Farron's doing, or her own, and it swallowed her, hanging past her knees, one sleeve rolled and one loose over the line taped into her hand. Her wounded side held her stiff and crooked. Her face was a whole storm map of bruise, but her eyes, fixed down the length of the dark hall on him, were wide awake and burning with purpose. "You can't read it," she said. Not a question. Her voice was wrecked, barely there. "You've been down here for hours. You can't read what's on it. Get back in bed. You don't have the key, and it isn't a password, it's the language. 10 years of Merseycant and Corsican shorthand that no one on your whole payroll but me can read." She took a step, dragging the pole, the wheel, shrieking, on the boards. "You could hand that card to every codebreaker on the coast, and they'd give you nonsense by Christmas. It isn't locked. It's just written in a tongue they were never taught. And the strike is a great deal sooner than Christmas." "What strike?" He was on his feet, Sidonie. "What strike?" She got herself to the chair on the near side of the desk before her legs gave out, folding into it with a gasp she tried to hide. He came around fast. She waved him off and dragged the laptop to her, and her ruined hands found the keys. And even fevered and shaking, she moved through the files like a key through a lock she had cut herself. Here. The screen filled with the dense shorthand, and under her fingers, it resolved, line by line, into plain and terrible sense. It was never only the wedding. The wedding was the parade. This is the robbery underneath it. She pulled up a schematic. A long, low building on the water, marked over in red. The raid shed 9. Your cash. The temperature in Marius dropped 10 degrees. That shed holds 400 crates off the Balkan boat. They know exactly what it holds. That's the whole point. Her finger moved across the red, the cameras, the dead angles strung between them, the breaker, the thin patch in the night rotation that Renzo himself had drawn up. They aren't blowing it. They're taking it. Esteve arms his own men with your weapons, and when the takeover comes, there's nothing in your armory to answer back. You lose the guns and wear the blame for whatever they do with them. She swallowed against a throat gone to sand. The trucks come at 4. Renzo opens the gate. He's running it himself. He sent Thibault a message swearing he'd hold the door. Marius looked at the clock on the desk. 3:11. "He's already gone to the water," Sidonie said quietly, slumping back as the crash came for her fast. "He stood in your foyer, smiled in your face, and drove straight to the raid to rob you before the sun's up." Marius crossed to the door, opened it, said one word, "Bram," and Bram was there. "Wake the crew, suppressed weapons, no explosives, nothing that lights up the water. We're going to the raid, and we go quiet." Bram vanished. He came back to the desk and drew a compact pistol from the drawer, checked it, and set it down in front of her, beside the cold coffee. "I don't know how to shoot," she said, staring at the black metal. "Point it at the door. If anyone but me opens that door, you empty it into whoever's standing there, and you don't stop to ask their name." He crouched to her level, and for a moment neither of them was a boss or a translator. "Lock this behind me." Her hand shot out and closed on his sleeve. The nails, digging in, were the only strong thing left in her. "Marius!" He went still. In 4 years she had informed him, corrected him, organized him, and cursed him fluently in 2 languages. She had never, in any of them, begged him for a single thing. He looked at her face and saw the thing beneath the fear, and it wasn't the Esteves, or the guns, or the dark. It was the oldest fear she owned, of being the one left behind, useless, waiting, while the people who mattered bled somewhere. She couldn't reach them. She had starved herself down to bone rather than ever be helpless. And here she was, pinned to a chair by her own failing body, watching him walk into the dark without her. "You're late to everything that matters," she whispered. "So be late to this one too. Be late to dying, Marius. Be so late they give up waiting for you, and come home." He reached out and drew his thumb along the unbruised edge of her jaw. over the too-hot skin, the pulse running fast beneath it. "I've never once missed an appointment with you," he said. "I'm not about to start." He crossed to the door. He looked back a single time. The small, fierce wreck of her, drowned in his shirt, the gun too large in her bandaged hand, and then he stepped into the hall and drew the door shut, and heard the deadbolt slide home behind him. Marius Voss went down his own stairs into the cold, and the last soft thing left his face, and what remained was the thing his enemies had spent 20 years pretending was only a story. Renzo had opened the gate for wolves. He was about to learn which one of them had raised the pack. The raid at 4 in the morning smelled of low tide and diesel and rust, and the rain had thinned to a cold mist that haloed the few working lamps. Marius left the car a quarter-mile out and came the rest of the way on foot, through the black canyon of stacked containers, and his men came with him out of the dark, 8 of them, Bram at his shoulder, all in flat black, faces buried in wet collars, no one saying a word. They had all studied the same map, Sidonie's map. They knew where the cameras couldn't see, and where the light didn't reach, and to the second, how long the gap in the rotation lasted, because the man who designed that rotation had sold it, and the woman dying in Marius's bed had stolen it back off a corpse. They moved the way she had drawn it for them, container to container, holding in the dead angles, crossing the lit gaps only in the counted seconds, when no lens could catch them. 4 years of Sidonie Merle's quiet, meticulous work had mapped every blind spot in his enemy's yard, and she had never held a gun to lay a single brick of it. Marius thought about that as he went. The deadliest thing at the raid tonight wasn't the pistol in his hand, or the 8 killers moving with him through the dark. It was a starving woman asleep across the city, with a needle's worth of thread in her side and the map she'd carried out of a stairwell on the last of her blood. 2 trucks at the south gate, Bram breathed, a finger pressed to his ear. Box trucks, empty, low on the springs, ready to load. "Kill the working lamps," Marius said. "When their engines stop, we move." Nobody on the Esteva side walks out of Shed 9, dark and silent. A dull metallic clunk rolled across the yard as the main breaker was thrown. The last lamps died, and the raid dropped into a thick, grainy black, lit only by the sick orange bruise of the city thrown back off the low clouds. Marius eased to the corner of a container and looked across the open ground at Shed 9. The rolling door stood up. Inside, under a single hooded work lamp, was Renzo Calder. He looked like a man on holiday. He'd found a crate to sit on and was turning a bottle of something in his hands, loose, laughing, low at whatever the Estève lieutenant beside him had said. 4 more of Estève's men stood around with rifles slung and muzzles down, wearing the bored, easy posture of a crew that expected to lift a few boxes and be home before the coffee cooled. "You're certain he won't come down here himself?" the lieutenant was saying, his voice carrying thin across the wet concrete. "Voss! Voss!" Renzo laughed outright at that. "Voss spent his whole day in the trench chasing his runaway secretary, and he'll spend tomorrow planning a wedding that is never going to happen. He trusts 3 people in this world, and I'm one of them." He took a pull off the bottle. "He won't know Shed 9 is empty until those trucks are halfway to the coast, and by then it's his name on the manifest and his neck in the frame. Load the crates." One of the Estève men didn't move yet. "And the woman?" "The one who pulled the file. Bled out on a floor in the trench 2 days ago." Renzo said it as easily as ordering a drink. "Nobody's coming for her. Nobody even knows to. That's the beauty of using the ones nobody thinks are worth anything. When they disappear, the world doesn't so much as blink." He tipped the bottle toward the crates. "Move. I'd like to be home before he's finished his breakfast." Marius stood in the dark 30 feet away and listened to 20 years of his life get spent like loose coins on a bar. He'd thought he was ready for it. He'd heard it from Sidonie, seen it in Renzo's own handwriting for himself, walked into this yard already knowing every word of it. It made no difference at all. Hearing the man laugh, the ease of it, the enjoyment, the total absence of anything like regret, did something final and very quiet inside him. The last thread in him that had wanted, against all sense and all evidence, for this to be a mistake, simply parted. There had been a night 20 years back, both of them 19, both of them starving, when Renzo had carried him 11 blocks through the snow with a knife wound in his gut and talked the whole way to keep him awake. And Marius had believed, with the whole of his stupid young heart, that some bonds could not be bought. He let the memory come, then he let it go, the way you let go of a rope that is only pulling you under. Beside him, Bram shifted, waiting, a question in the set of his shoulders. Marius gave the smallest shake of his head. Not yet. Let the man finish the sentence he'd spent 20 years building toward. Let him believe, for 3 more breaths, that he had won. He drew the pistol. The metal was as cold as the water at the end of the pier. On my move, he said into the dark. And 8 men went still as held breath around him. Renzo tipped the bottle up again, smiling at the ceiling. A man entirely certain he had gotten away with it. Marius stepped out of the shadow of the containers and into the open. He walked into the open, and the gravel spoke under his boots, and Renzo Calder saw him. The bottle stopped halfway to his mouth. In the hooded lamplight, his face did something almost comic, the grin still hanging there, frozen while the eyes behind it dropped a very long way, very fast. Marius. The Esteve men were quicker than their boss. 4 rifles came up. They never fired. From the black tops of the containers, Bram and the crew opened up, and the suppressed rounds came down like hard rain on tin. Flat, fast, no flash worth the name. The lieutenant folded first. The others managed nothing. One squeezed a wild burst up into the corrugated roof before the dark took him down as well, and then the yard was quiet again, ringing. And the only man of Esteve still standing was the one on the crate, because Marius had told them to leave him. It had lasted perhaps 4 seconds. He had designed it to. When it was over, the shed smelled of cordite and spilled brandy, and the copper reek of opened men, and the rain ticked steadily on the tin roof, and 8 of Marius's crew came down off the containers without a word, reloading, checking corners, unhurried and precise as surgeons closing up. Esteve had sent boys with rifles to lift a few crates in the dark. Marius had sent the thing that lived underneath the story his enemies told their children to keep them in at night. Renzo hadn't moved. He sat there, bottle in hand, in a shed full of the freshly dead, staring at his oldest friend crossing the concrete toward him. "Get up," Marius said. Renzo got up. The bottle slid from his fingers and burst on the floor, and the reek of cheap brandy spread across the concrete. His hands came up, and the words were already tumbling out, fast and pleading. "It's not Marius. It's not what it looks like. Esteve came to me. He threatened my sister. He swore he'd put her in the ground if I didn't open the gate. What was I supposed to?" "You don't have a sister," Marius said. Renzo stopped. "You have a mother in Naples who thinks you sell insurance," Marius went on, his voice terribly even. "And you have 20 years of standing precisely 1 step behind me, and you have a promise from Thibaut Esteve that once I was in the ground, this harbor would finally be yours." He watched the lie die in his friend's throat. "Say the true thing, Renzo. You've earned that much. Just once." For a moment, Renzo's face was nothing at all. Then the fear curdled into something older and uglier, something that had plainly been sitting under the grin for a very long time. "You want the true thing?" His voice dropped and shook. "The true thing is I took a bullet for your father when I was 19 years old. 19. And what did it buy me? Your dog." Good old Renzo, loyal Renzo, stands behind Marius and holds his coat. 20 years. I waited for you to put my name on the door beside yours, and you never even saw me standing there." His voice cracked, and 20 years came loose through the seam of it, all at once. "You know what your father called me? At the end, in that hospital bed? He called me his son, because you were closing the Vasari deal, and you didn't get there in time, so it was my hand he was holding when he went. and I sat there and held the hand of the man who let me take a bullet for him and never once said, "Thank you." And I listened to him give another man the only word I ever wanted. His face twisted. "So don't stand there like I'm the only blade in this room, Marius. You made me. Every single year you looked straight through me. You were sharpening it." His lip curled off his teeth. Esteve offered me a chair, a real one. So yes. I opened the gate. And knowing everything I know now, I'd open it again. And I'd smile doing it. "I know you would," Marius said quietly. "That's the only reason we're standing here." Renzo's eyes moved to the folded lieutenant, to the black tops of the containers, to the pistol hanging at Marius's side, running the math he had always been good at, and finding, for the first time in his life, that the numbers gave him nothing back. His hand began to drift, slow and casual, toward the small of his back. "I wouldn't," Bram said from the dark above, and a red dot bloomed on Renzo's chest and settled there, steady as a full stop at the end of a sentence. Renzo's hand came back into the light, empty. He almost laughed. "You brought your whole choir." "I brought what the work required," Marius said. "Over a woman." Renzo's eyes flicked wild, hunting for any handhold. "You'd end me, end us, over a bookkeeper? Some little clerk who files your papers and can't hold your eye across a room? She's not my bookkeeper." Marius raised the pistol, and his hand was perfectly steady. "She's the only honest thing I have left in this world. She read your handwriting back to me while she was bleeding to death, on a floor you helped put her on. And she never let go of the proof, not once, not even dying." His voice did not rise a hair. "You want the true thing, Renzo? Here it is. You were never standing behind me. All this time you were standing in front of her, and she is the reason you are already a dead man." "Marius, please." He fired twice. Renzo went back against the crates and slid down them and came to rest, almost peaceful, his eyes open on the roof and seeing none of it. The bottle he dropped rolled away across the concrete, and the shed went very quiet. Marius lowered the gun. For a long minute, he stood over the body of the man who had once hauled him 11 blocks through the snow, who had sworn on his father's grave, and he felt nothing. A vast, level, spotless nothing, cold and clean as new ice. It would cost him later. He knew that the way you know weather coming in off the sea. Tonight, there was simply no room in him for it. He had learned young that grief was a debt you could defer, and violence a bill that came due the instant you signed it, and that a man who confused the order of those two things did not last long in his line of work. So he took the weight of Renzo Calder, 20 years of it, folding shut like a book, and he carried it into the cold locked room inside himself, where he kept everything he could not yet afford to feel. He would open that door eventually. "Not here. Not tonight, boss." Bram, at his shoulder, low. "Load Esteve's men into their own trucks," Marius said, turning away from the crate. "Drive them to the marina and park them at the foot of Thibaut Esteve's gangway with the keys still in them, so the old man is in no doubt about the return address." He stopped at the shed's mouth and did not look back at Renzo. "Him, too. Put him behind the wheel of the lead truck. Thibaut sent me a friend to open my gate. Let him see, up close, exactly what I send home." Behind him, his crew were already moving, quiet and efficient, and the truck's engines turned over one by one, and the dead were arranged in their seats with a care that was somehow worse than any carelessness. Marius didn't watch them do it. He'd given the order. The order was the whole of his part in it now. He walked out of Shed 9 into the thinning rain, and the cold air hit him, and only now did he notice his hands had begun to shake, not from what he had just done, but from what was still waiting for him across the city. He got into the car and turned it toward home, and drove too fast through the flooded streets. And the whole way there was only one thought in his head, sharp and childish and enormous. Let her still be breathing. Let her still be there. The estate was still wide awake when he came back, every window burning, the gate guards doubled, but it felt emptier than the whole of the trench, because the only room that mattered in it was locked. He climbed to the study wing with his ruined shirt glued to him, stinking of gunsmoke and brine and other men's blood, and stopped at the door where he'd left her. The handle wouldn't turn. The bolt was thrown. She had done exactly as he'd told her. And the proof of that an hour ago, she'd been awake and able to throw a bolt, nearly took his legs out from under him. He set his forehead against the cool wood. He tried again, quieter, in the language that had always been theirs, and nobody else's. C'est moi, je suis en retard. It's me, I'm late. A long pause. Then the drag of a wooden stool, slow across the boards, and the bolt sliding back. The door opened a hand's width, and there she was, drowned in his shirt, gray with exhaustion, held upright by the IV pole, and sheer refusal. In her lowered hand the pistol hung loose, her finger flat along the guard where he'd shown her to keep it, in the space of a single sentence, hours ago. She looked at his face, at the blood on him that wasn't his, and read the whole night off him in a second, the way she read everything. You had the gun on that door the entire time, he said. And you didn't fire. You spoke French. Her cracked mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The men who'd come to kill me wouldn't have known to be late. Her eyes fell shut. Only you are ever late. Then the last of the tension simply ran out of her all at once, and her legs buckled. He caught her before she reached the floor, an arm behind her back, the other beneath her knees. And this time, she didn't fight it. She turned her face into his shoulder, into the wet ruined shirt, and let him carry her weight. He carried her past the guest room, past the study, its laptop still glowing with the wreck of the Esteve plan. He carried her into his own rooms, where a fire he had never lit was burning low, because someone on his staff had guessed right, and he laid her in the middle of his own bed, on sheets the color of ash, and for a moment only stood and looked at her there. I need to wash the docs off me, he said. I'm not going anywhere. Her voice was a thread. Can't feel much below the ribs, or most of the rest of me. In the bathroom he ran the water scalding and stood under it, and watched it run gray, then finally clear, carrying the raid and the gun smoke and the memory of Renzo's face down the drain. He scrubbed until his skin stung. When he came back in low trousers, towel around his neck, she was awake, watching the firelight throw shapes across the ceiling, the old scars and the older ink bare to her for the first time in 4 years. Farron said sleep. He said. Farron says a great many things. She rolled her head to look at him. Even now, fevered, wounded, half dead, her mind would not stop turning, and he loved and hated it in equal measure. The accounts. If we've truly cut the Esteve roots, you've lost the southern lane and about a third of your legitimate cover. We move everything through the northern brokers by week's end, or the shells start tripping alarms, and the brokers will gouge you blind, so I should start the calls tonight, before Mercer realizes the lane's dead and Sidoni, and freezes the holding accounts, which would be catastrophic. So if you just bring me the Sidoni. He leaned over her, a hand braced either side of her shoulders, until she stopped. Her eyes came up to his, close now, stripped of every professional wall she had ever built. I executed my oldest friend 2 hours ago. I carried you out of a slum tonight. And you are lying in my bed with a hole in your side, trying to renegotiate broker fees. Someone, she said faintly, has to keep the books straight. I was blind without you keeping them. I understand that now, completely. He reached out and with the back of one finger moved a strand of damp hair off the bruise on her cheek. So listen, because I'll only say each of these once. Mallow's facility outside Lyon took a wire an hour ago. It's funded. The good wing, the garden, the kind people, all of it, for the rest of his life, out of a trust with your name on it and my money inside it. That's finished. It isn't a favor, and you cannot hand it back. Her lips parted. Nothing came out. The flat on Ardwick Row is done. Bram has your things. And the moment they're clear of it, he held her eyes. He is going to burn that building to its foundations, and I am going to enjoy the phone call telling me he did. Marius, You can't simply, the medal. He drew it from his pocket, the little Saint Christopher, its chain mended with a twist of wire, and pressed it into her bandaged hand, folding her fingers closed around it. The card was back inside. The proof and the saint together, exactly where she had hidden his entire survival. This is yours. It was always yours. But you are not carrying my secrets in it any longer, and you are never going back to a desk outside my door. I'm your assistant, she whispered. It came out, less like a fact than a question, the last handhold she had left. No, he said it gently and completely, with no room in it for argument. You're my partner. You have been for 4 years. I was only ever too much of a coward to use the word. And if anyone in this city so much as looks at you sideways again, Sidoni, I will make tonight look like a courtesy. She stared up at him, at the man who had walked out into the dark and come home wearing another man's blood for her sake. And something behind her eyes, some wall she'd held up so long she had forgotten it was a choice, quietly came down. You're a monster, she breathed. But it was different now. There was no edge left on it at all. You've been telling me that in French for 4 years, he said. I've never disagreed. A laugh ghosted out of her and turned into sleep almost before it finished. Her hand curled tight around the metal, her body finally giving up the fight and letting go. Marius drew the sheet over her shoulder. He didn't leave. He stretched out on top of the covers beside her, close enough to feel the fever heat lifting off her skin, close enough to count each breath, and lay awake in the firelight, listening to her live, while somewhere out in the wet dark, a man he'd loved rode home in the front seat of a truck to the wrong father's door. There was one Estave left to answer for it. That was a matter for the morning. Morning came in hard and gold through the tall windows. The storm scoured out of the sky overnight, and Marius Voss was already up. He stood at the glass in a clean white shirt, sleeves shoved past the elbow, a cup of black coffee going cold in one hand and a fresh phone warming in the other. The screen showed a Marseille number. He let it ring twice, for reasons of his own, and answered, Marius Voss. Thibaut Esteve's voice came down the line with every smooth thing stripped out of it. The flat, careful voice of a man who had walked down to his own gangway that morning and found what waited for him in the trucks. You have made a terrible mistake. Good morning, Thibaut. I trust the delivery arrived. Marius sipped the cold coffee. I wanted you to have it before you sailed. You butchered my men. You put Calder behind a. The old man's control slipped. Just slightly. This is war. This is an invoice, Marius said. Paid in full. You sent a courier to open my translator up on a stairwell and a friend to open my gate, and you meant to poison me at my own wedding and let my city toast the men who did it. I know all of it. It's written down, in a hand your daughter will recognize on sight, and copies of it are resting in places you will never reach. He set the coffee aside. So here is the arrangement, and there is exactly one. The wedding is dead. Izor is free. She can marry a fishing fleet for all I care, provided she does it a long way from here. Your product does not move through my harbor. Your trucks do not cross my line, and your men do not breathe my air again, ever. You cannot hold the northern lanes without Marseille capital, Thibaut said, but the certainty had bled out of it. You will be bankrupt by winter. My books are cleaner than you think, and my accountant just came back from the dead in a very bad mood. Marius watched the light move on the water below the house. Sail this morning, Thibaut. If the sun goes down tonight, and there is still an Esteve in my city, I won't send the next ones home in trucks. I'll send them home in smaller boxes than that. He let it sit. Don't call this number again. He hung up before the old man could find a reply, dropped the phone into his pocket, and stood a while letting the quiet of a finished war settle over the room. It felt like nothing. It always did. The only thing in the whole house that felt like anything at all was in his bed. Behind him, the sheets stirred. Did you sleep at all? Sidoni said, her voice rough with it. Or did you just stand there brooding at the harbor and calling it strategy? He turned. She had pushed herself up against the headboard, swamped in his shirt, the bruise on her face gone, the yellow-green of a thing that was healing. The little St. Christopher still knotted through her fingers where it had stayed all night. The fever had broken. Her eyes were clear for the first time since he'd found her. Clear and sharp, and fixed on him with the wariness of a person who remembers, in daylight, every soft thing that was said in the dark. "I handled Marseille," he said. "I heard. Smaller boxes." One brow arched a fraction. "Very restrained of you." She shifted, winced, and reached. Of course she reached. For the tablet on the nightstand. So? "If the Estevlane is genuinely dead, then before noon, we'll need to Sidonie? Reroute the northern brokers, and I want to see the wire to Melo's facility with my own eyes, because I do not trust your people to read a French account number without. You're doing it again." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, took the tablet gently out of her hands, and set it face down on the far nightstand, where she'd have to come through him to reach it. "Farron comes at noon. You are not touching an account, a broker, or a spreadsheet for 2 weeks. You're going to eat real food. You're going to sleep. And you're going to let someone else carry the weight for once in your entire life." "I'm bad at that," she admitted, and a little color rose in her face that had nothing to do with any fever. "I noticed. 4 years. I noticed." He looked at her, the woman who had made herself small enough to vanish, so no one could ever use her against him, who had bled herself white on a freezing floor, rather than let him think for 1 second that she was a liability. And he found that he wanted, more than the harbor, more than the win, one single thing he had never let himself reach for. "Do something for me," he said. "That depends entirely on what it is. 4 years ago, you stood in my study and called me a heartless monster, in French, and you would not look at me when you said it." He held her gaze. "Say it again. The whole of it." And this time, the old grin came, softer now, and wholly hers. "Look at me." The color climbed her throat, the same as it had 4 years ago. Still the most honest thing about her. For a long moment, she said nothing. Her fingers tightened around the little silver saint. And then Sidonie Merle looked at him, full on, unguarded, everything she had spent 4 years hiding, laid out plain in the open. And what came out of her, quiet and steady, and in French, was not the curse he'd asked for. "Mon monstre." Marius went very still. "That isn't what you said 4 years ago," he managed. "No." Her eyes did not leave his. "But it's what I meant." He leaned in and pressed his mouth to her forehead, to the fading edge of the bruise, and stayed there. Not a boss, not a killer, only a man who had at last, at ruinous cost, learned to look straight at the one person who had never once looked away from him. Her free hand came up and fisted in the front of his clean white shirt, and neither of them said anything more, because there was nothing left that needed a language. Marius Voss didn't cancel a wedding for love. Not at first. He canceled it because a woman he had overlooked for 4 years had bled quietly into the cracks of his empire to hold the whole thing upright, and because the moment he finally understood that the alliance and the crown and the entire ordered lie of his life turned to ash in his hands. He walked away from a Marseille throne. He burned down a slum. He put his oldest friend in the ground, all of it for the quiet one who kept his books, and cursed him under her breath, and never ever let him fall. And that is how a monster learns his own name. Spoken softly, in French, by the one person who was never afraid of him. If this one got its hooks into you, the loyalty, the slow burn, the quiet ones who turn out to be holding all the power, then do me a favor before you go. Hit that like button. Subscribe for more dark romances where the overlooked ones come out on top, and send this to the person you know will feel it. And tell me down in the comments, what was the exact moment you knew Marius would burn it all to the ground for her? I read every single one. I'll see you in the next story.